Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining. At CIQ, we're focused on powering the next generation of software infrastructure, leveraging the capabilities of cloud, hyperscale, and HPC. From research to the enterprise, our customers rely on us for the ultimate Rocky Linux, Werewolf, and Apptainer support escalation. We provide deep development capabilities and solutions, all delivered in the collaborative spirit of open source.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Oh, my goodness. And hello, everybody that is watching from out there. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. So this is actually really cool. I feel like it's been a long time because last week was Thanksgiving. The week before we were at SC. So we were like all over the place trying to do live videos as much as we could. And so some of that came through. So thanks for watching and for being there. I hope you had a nice Thanksgiving. So we're back today with the dream team here is what I call you guys. This is really amazing. So today we're going to be talking about, the name of it is Container Education Series, Security Features of Apptainer versus Rootless Podman. Now this comparison was actually an ask from Kevin Schoen. So thank you very much. He was also at SC. So he kind of reached out to us and said, Rose, like I want a breakdown. And so Dave Godlove, thank you, Dave, for all of your work. He was like, okay, like I know that on the surface, but let me dive into it. Let me dive into and really give a like full, I think it ended up being how many blogs? 3.
Yeah, it was three blogs long because I started writing it and started writing some more, and it was all originally just like one blog, and then I was like, you know what? Nobody's gonna sit down and read this all in one shot. This is too much, so we just split it up into 3.
Yeah, so someone behind the scenes is going to grab that link for you guys. I mean, it's definitely on our website, so you can just easily go to ciq.com and go to blogs and blog posts, and there's a little area there where you can search for stuff. So just put in Apptainer and Podman. So yes, thank you for all of that work that you did, really kind of giving a layout of what are the benefits of each of those and a couple of the drawbacks. So that's actually what today is one of the things that we're going to be talking about is this Apptainer versus Rootless Podman. So I think I think everyone knows you guys, but it's probably appropriate to like say hi, say your name, just introduce yourself. So we'll start with Dave.
Cool. I'm just making comments right now in the YouTube chat with the links to the 3 parts of the blog series. Yeah, it just occurred to me I can do it myself. Yeah, so I'm Dave Godlove. So I've been around the container community for quite some time. I used to be a research scientist, and then I worked as a staff scientist at the BioWolf cluster at the NIH for a while, and been with HPC containers really since they started about 6 years ago.
Yeah. We were actually on a call today talking to a university who is really wanting to like rebuild their cluster, which is something that we have been doing with people, and you guys have been helping with that. So thank you. Not helping, doing it. So thank you for all of that work. And one of the things that we have been sharing is that we do Apptainer training. And that was really interesting to them because and Dave, you really are the one. Dave does the Apptainer training. I think a couple of you are kind of like learning that too. But
it's starting to branch out. Yeah.
It is branching out. Yes.
Forrest just who's unfortunately unable to join us today. He just did one himself. Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. I think one of like the key things that I like to share with people specifically about your experience is that you kind of came to it not necessarily from a system administration perspective, that you came to, well, originally Singularity, but the concept of containers and Apptainer from a user, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I was a staff scientist when containers first started, but it was, I was a user of HPC systems before I was an administrator, and so I kind of knew a lot of the challenges and stuff.
Right, exactly. So you bring that breadth of understanding and depth of knowledge, and so we can go in that direction and give trainings and help people understand how to actually use it too. So it's not like the sysadmins having to do all of that training as well. So yeah, very exciting. Cool. All right, Jonathan, who are you, man? Who are you?
Yeah, thanks, Rose. So, hello, everyone. I'm Jonathan Anderson, and I'm here on the Solutions Architect team as well. And my background is in academic high performance computing also, but from that systems perspective. So, I first touched containerization through Singularity when we had an end user that just had to run a certain piece of software that only ran on Ubuntu. And we were running, I think, a CentOS cluster at the time. And generally speaking, that's a non-starter. But I had heard of this new thing that was, taking universities by storm, and thought, I think that's the right tool for this job. And someone else on the team had tried to do it, and it had kind of gotten lost in the weeds because of at the time, the requirement that you build things with root. And so we were trying to figure out how to get it set up like on a laptop and then move the container over. But then I found, at the time, what you needed, a remote build service to try and build things with. And over the course of a day, had a fully working container that ran their application on the HPC cluster, and it was glorious, and a new day had dawned. So yeah, I'm really excited to learn more about the rootless version of that, because this idea that in order to use or build containers, you have to have some level of root access still persists. And I've enjoyed reading some of the articles that Dave's put together, but I'm here to learn more.
Yeah, awesome. Great, thank you. Brian?
Hey, Brian Fan here, also a solutions architect here at CIQ. My background's also in HPC administration and architecture. I've been using Apptainer back when it was Singularity around 2017. And yeah, it's been a great tool. I've used it to onboard customers, get them up and running, and where they needed an extremely fast turnaround time, I was able to whip up a container for them, get them up and running, and they were super happy about it, and excited for today's webinar, where Dave is going to drop some knowledge on us.
Drop the knowledge, Dave. This is very exciting. So, I mean, I can
pressure.
No pressure.
Questions?
Be smart.
Or do you kind of have a place where you want to start?
So we can just sort of step through the blog post. I think is the best way to do this and go through it. I'm happy to just sort of was that the question? Like, where do we want to start talking about this?
Yeah. I didn't know if you wanted me to pose questions really, or if you kind of where it is that you want to start, because probably just a broad understanding of what Apptainer is, right? Define, and then what Podman is, a little bit of the history of where it came from, of why we're comparing the two.
Absolutely. Yeah. And maybe we should step back a little bit and just talk about it too, so after I put this together, I started to think, maybe this series of blog posts is poorly named. And the reason for that is because it's Apptainer versus Rootless Podman with a big VS, kind of almost like we're going to pit the two against each other. And let me just set expectations from the start and be like, this is not, this is not like an adversarial kind of series of blog posts. We're not going to try to claim that one is better than the other. Both of these container platforms offer a great deal in the way of security, and both of them are perfectly secure container platforms to run your containers in. If you set the appropriate options and you take the appropriate measures and you do the right things. There's differences between them, and there's similarities between them, and I think that's kind of what we wanted to highlight here is where do they both stand, what are their postures and their philosophies and stuff like that, as far as different security features. And also security is when I say I hate to talk about security a lot of times because it's a huge topic. You talk about container
maybe let's say reasonably or sufficiently or appropriately secure rather than perfectly secure.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, security is their entire, I think I say this in the blog too, but there's entire companies that their entire model and reason for being is container security. So you can make a living out of this. This is complicated stuff. So I'm really just going to talk about some particular aspects and features and things, and not really, do an extensive, complete, deep dive of everything that there is. But, yeah, so it's a big topic. I'm just going to cover a few slivers of it, and it's really not meant to be like an adversarial us, this against that, us against them kind of, kind of blog post.
And if you ever get that vibe from anyone at CIQ, like call us out on it, because that is not intentional. There's no need for any of that.
Right on. So yeah, so I mean, I guess we could start off just talking about the two platforms from a historical perspective, and kind of like where they came from. Now, the blog post suffers a little bit from the fact that I was actually there and present and in the community for the genesis of one of these container platforms and not the other. So I can speak a bit more authoritatively about kind of like the reason for Apptainers being and where it came from and how it was developed and stuff. I have to kind of go through whatever's available on GitHub and do things like that to kind of talk about where Podman came from. I was there. I kind of remember when Podman started up and people were talking about it, but I wasn't there. I wasn't helping to develop it because it was being developed when it first started at Red Hat as a closed source product when it first started. So I didn't have any opportunity to kind of like go over and see what was going on. But I'll give you what I think, and we can kind of chat about it too. Maybe others have different perspectives as well. I kind of think that both container platforms started a little bit as a reaction to Docker and what Docker was doing in the space at the time, but it was different reactions and different different objectives, I guess. So Apptainer really started at the time as Singularity, as it was kind of like a response to Docker, but it was kind of like it was just more of a response to like Docker and other container platforms, of which there weren't many that were super popular at the time, not working very well in HPC. And I've told this story a lot. Like basically, if you were an admin around the 2015, 2016 time period of an HPC cluster, you were having advanced users come to you and say, "Hey, can you install Docker? I need Docker." And so Apptainer, then Singularity, was really a kind of a like, well, no, we can't install Docker in the HPC environment, but let's just purpose build a container platform for HPC, and let's do it with HPC in mind, and let's set intelligent defaults, and let's do all the stuff to make sure that this is like a nice, smoothly operating container platform in HPC. As I understand it, Podman was a little different, but it was also kind of a reaction to Docker. It was like, okay, well, let's so Docker has some things to it that we find to be a little bit unattractive from a security standpoint. It's got this daemon that runs that kind of like manages your containers in the background on your behalf. And that process has to keep running all the time. And like, you have to be part of a special group to run, to use that daemon. And however you kind of put it together, at some point, a user has to have some privileges to run containers. And so let's make and I should say too, that this was several years later. This was around 2018 that Podman, started to show up and became, something on the scene. But like, basically it was like, let's do a drop-in replacement for Docker where you can have all the same commands. We will replicate pretty much all the same functionality as Docker, but let's do it without a daemon, and let's leverage this kind of newish thing called the user namespace, which almost virtualizes privilege. And let's instead of actually giving users privilege and to start containers and do the things that they need to do to fire containers up, let's use the user namespace, which is like a virtual pathway to privilege, to do this instead. And so and that's pretty much what Podman does. So the leveraging the virtualization of privilege is specifically with rootless Podman. So that's you can run root full Podman where you just use sudo, and you just run it as root. But you can also run, if you're on a properly configured system and you've got access to the user namespace, you can also run rootless podman and do it like that. So that's kind of the history on the two.
Cool. Appreciate that. Was there anything that you guys, Jonathan, wanted to add to that?
Not to add, I would have a follow-up question. So like I have my own perspective on this, but what would you say that, and I know we're not being adversarial here, but what remains of value in Apptainer versus running rootless, aside from the security things that we're going to go through? Is there still a use case for using one or the other in a rootless case for both?
Yeah, so if you fast forward a little bit, okay, so way back, in 2015, 2016, when Apptainer was first being developed, there were user namespaces. That was a thing. It existed, but nobody used them, right? They had a lot of vulnerabilities associated with them, and they had a reputation among admins as being dangerous. And so by default, if you had, at that time, I think people were running either Enterprise Linux 6 or Enterprise Linux 7. And by default, you either didn't have access in your kernel to user namespaces on your system at all, or you did, and it was turned off by default. And admins were like, I'm not going to turn something on that has been turned off at the factory, and that I'm hearing a bunch of stuff about how, I see CVEs about it, and I hear other people saying how it's dangerous. So like, and that's kind of funny, because a lot of people, there was a lot of talk about user namespaces, but it was like, from a practical standpoint, it's just talk. We can't use the user namespace. So Apptainer had to come up with a different way to allow users that didn't have root privileges to use containers. And so what Apptainer did is the developers created a set UID workflow. So there was a root-owned binary within the installation that would effectively run commands as root. Now, of course, everybody knows that set UID, or a lot of people know, most people should know, that set UID binaries are notoriously difficult to develop and to maintain in a way that's safe, right? So like ping, for instance. Ping used to be a set UID binary because it opens raw sockets on your behalf. So it used to be that when, if you looked at ping, it was owned by root, and like it ran as root. And they were just, the developers of ping were just very careful to say that the only root operation that you can do within this is to open raw sockets, and you can't do anything else. And so that's kind of like, what we used to do with Apptainer is there were certain privilege operations. So there was a binary which would selectively escalate privileges on your behalf to do certain operations, and that had to be locked down and, had to be very carefully enforced. There's other things about Apptainer that are sort of different. So, if you're not using the user namespace, how do you get a user inside the container? And the way that Apptainer does that is to just dynamically figure out your UID and to write it into Etsy password, and same with your GID, and write an entry into Etsy groups when your container starts up.
Yeah, inside the container.
Right? Yeah, inside the container. Yeah. And that's kind of like different from, any other container platform, really. It's like, it's pretty specific to Apptainer. That's the way it handles users. And then in order to like further lock stuff down, Apptainer also by default mounts your file system with a no set UID flag on it, so that you can't, run, like for instance, ping I just got done talking about. You would not be able to run ping or sudo. You would not be able to use sudo within the file system, just because that's a set UID bit program that escalates privileges and you can't use it. And it also, in addition to that, there's a starter process that kicks off inside the container. And that starter process sets a kernel flag, that the purpose of the kernel flag is to prevent that process or any children processes from escalating privileges using any means. So all that stuff is kind of legacy and is in Apptainer just because Apptainer was around before user namespaces were like popular and in wide use. And none of that stuff's in, Podman, because Podman just uses the user namespace, right? So now I think what you're alluding to, Jonathan, is like, so these days, Apptainer, the default installation of Apptainer now no longer installs that set UID bit. You can do it if you want to. You can install that set UID bit if you want to, but by default, it just leverages the user namespace and runs, what we call rootless mode. But even though it does that, it still has that other stuff, right? It still has the no new privs flag set on its new process that runs. It's got the no SUID bit or flag that it mounts the file system with by default, and it also handles users differently. It also still makes those entries in Etsy password and Etsy groups. And so I would so I don't know if that security is kind of redundant. It's not necessarily like more secure or something like that. It's just like redundant. It adds different layers of security that aren't there with Podman. That might be attractive to users.
Well, the user management stuff is also part of, we talk about Apptainer having intelligent defaults that are suitable for HPC expectations. So one of those is being the same user inside the container. But I would imagine another is things like automatically having your home directory or the current directory available, which is, another way I think I've heard you say that we talk about this being integration over isolation, and just speaks to Apptainer having a different set of priorities from most Podman use cases, I think.
Exactly. And then another thing we haven't, I think it's kind of like further along in the blog series, and maybe we should wait to talk about it. But another kind of big differentiator is when we start talking about container encryption and container signing and verification, and like how that happens. Like, so Podman allows you to do those things too. But because the container format is OCI, that is, it's a series of tarballs that we call layers and a manifest to stitch them all together in a certain way. It's kind of like you can't really do that at the file level. So instead, things are encrypted or signed and verified at the registry level. Whereas with Apptainer, your container is a file, right? It's a CIF file that's got some partitions inside of it, that's got the root file system and some blobs of data, and so you can just encrypt that same as you can encrypt any other file. And that's the way in which Apptainer works. And the same with signing and verification. You can actually attach the signature to the file itself, and then it can run around and you can put it. It doesn't matter anymore where the container is or where you've gotten it from or how you stored it or whatever. It's still signed, and you can still verify it.
So I actually have a question about that. Does the signature go away once you have taken that container into your own space? Right? Because then you can make modifications to it, right? Like say you go to Docker Hub and you get the container and now it's yours and you're doing different things to it. It no longer is signed, right?
Which kind of container are you talking about? Are you talking about an OCI container or a Apptainer container? Brian, I saw you come off. Go ahead, man.
I think when you pull it, it is signed, but I think when you modify it, you're basically, it should be immutable when you pull it down, right? But if you're modifying it, you're basically creating a new container, which then needs to be signed if you're going to be uploading it back to Docker Hub, for example.
Yeah, and that's true with either the OCI model or the CIF model. In either case, you don't so much modify a container image as build a new one based off of a previous image. And so the original one that you're basing it off of will carry a signature, but the new one would have to be re-signed, and then that signature would incorporate the changes and the original as part of what it's signing.
Kind of did a look, Dave. What were you?
Yeah, I mean, there's some nuance there. I mean, so in OCI land, creating a new container is essentially creating a new layer, right, on top of that base.
Yeah.
And So you can get back to that container, just by kind of backtracking and as long as you've not done anything weird, you can go back and like pull out the previous layer. But yeah, the signature is kind of like, that's a separate entity that would have to be applied during the step of pushing that container up to the registry. That's actually when you sign. So like you sign it as it's not signed on your system. It's signed.
Yeah, it's signed in the manifest that identifies it. You're basically signing, in like a Git term, you're signing the tag of what that container is rather than.
And then you verify as part of the pull process, as part of getting the container back, you verify that. With Apptainer, the internal guts are that there is so you've got this CIF file and it's got several different partitions in it. And one of the partitions is a file system, and the file system is saved in a special format, which is called Squash FS or Squash File System. It's called Squash File System because it's compressed. It takes all the bits and just squashes them down. And it's kind of cool because the Linux kernel is able to mount and run that file system without decompressing it. So it's like, you can mount it compressed and you never have to like explode it back out and waste all that disk space and do all that kind of stuff. But the trade-off is that it's immutable, and it's like, I mean, there's no way to make, like, the technology does not allow you to write to it. So if you're going to change your container, you essentially just have to build a new container. There's no way around it. You have to build a new container. And so once you've done that, like, I mean, you could, through the magic of the CIF tool, grab an existing signature and add it to the new container that you have built. But part of the verification process is to run kind of like a checksum and check and see what's inside the container and see if it matches, what was used to sign the container. And so if you just jammed one in there like that, it wouldn't verify anymore. It'd say, nope, this container's changed. I can't verify it anymore. So in either case, you've got to re-sign it.
Yeah, and I think that's the crux, Rose, of your question. It's not so much is the signature physically on my disk when I pull a container down, and is it still there if I make changes? Is that signature still valid? And in either case, whether the signature is coming from a manifest from your registry or if it's encoded in the CIF, if you're making modifications, you're conceptually making a new container, and the original signature would be invalidated. You have to re-sign the new content.
But I guess like the difference between Apptainer and OCI then is like, if I have a container sitting on disk with Apptainer, what that means is I have a CIF file somewhere that I can do file management stuff with. And if I want to either sign or check to see if that container is signed, I can do that without any, external anything else. In the OCI world, if you have a container sitting on disk, what that actually means is you've got some directory somewhere, which is managed on your behalf, which you're not really looking or not supposed to look at yourself, that has a bunch of tarballs in a manifest and an entire directory structure. And if you want to sign that, there's no way to sign it on disk. And if you want to verify that it's signed, there's no way to verify it on disk. You have to have either a local registry that you've got running, or you have to have an external registry like Docker Hub that you can push and pull to in order to do, because that whole signing and verification process is part of the pushing and pulling. So that's kind of like the difference.
So to kind of wrap that back around into the topic for today, we're talking about Apptainer specifically. Does Podman allow for signatures as well? Do they do that?
Yeah. So that's you have to kind of go through to the third part of the blog post.
The blog posts.
To see this, to see, I think it's the third parts. Yeah. So if you go through the third part of the blog post, I guess I could share it real quick if that's helpful. I'm going to be like fully honest here. I would give everybody a live demo of all this stuff, except I did it all in a VM that I kind of forgot where the VM is at now. I use a lot of different VMs, and there's like some setup that you have to do ahead of time and that I failed to do. So sorry, not gonna.
Wait, there was one live show that we were doing where something happened where you had to like actually take your camera. And, what was that? I forgot.
Dave. I don't want to talk about it anymore. I don't want to talk about
it. You got the live bug. It happens. It totally happens.
Did I share? Can people see this now?
I don't know. I think Alex needs to do something from the back end.
Yeah, there we
go.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Giving me PTSD thinking about that. I was like, oh my God, it's not going to share. All right. So, yeah. So this is the third part. Yeah. If we go up here, this is like part 3, which kind of walks through this stuff. So how do we cryptographically assign and verify containers based on, if they're CIF files or if they're OCI, and it uses, OCI is like, can be a lot of different tooling, but it uses Podman here because that's what we're talking about in this blog post. So Apptainer containers, you sign them and verify them. Excuse me. There is one part of this that I didn't talk about before, and that is where do you get the private? So a signature, like a key, has 2 different parts to it. It's got the public and the private part to the signature key. So, and you need, when you're signing a container, you use the private key to sign it, and then anybody can then verify it using the public key material. So the question is, where do you get that public key material? And by default, you can push the public key material after you're done signing something. And by default, Apptainer is configured to go look for that material at keys.openpgp.org. And so, for instance, if somebody here were to pull one of my signed containers CIF files from Docker Hub and do a verify under the hood, Apptainer is going to go up and grab that that open the public key material from openpgp.org, and then just it's going to go ahead and verify it and spit out the fingerprint and show that it's been signed. And then you can import that and have it all local. You could verify the container without having any internet connection, So here's kind of like the workflow. You use the key new pair commands. I'm gonna make that a little bit bigger to create a new pair of keys, and that pair is like the public and private pair. Then you can list that you've got that key, so here it is, and here's the fingerprint. You can sign it, and then you can go ahead and push that key just so that anybody then can verify. You don't have to do this part to verify your own containers because you've already got that key, saved locally in your cache. But now anybody, who gets a hold of your containers can go up there and get your container and verify it. And so then this is the other half of that. So you pull an image, or you have an image or whatever. And then as a separate kind of thing, so I'm showing this LS here just to show that after you pull this image, you actually have a file that is the container. And then as a separate thing here, you do this verification step, and it's going to end up telling you what fingerprint it was signed with and so on. Now, if we go down to, so if we go down to Podman, and we have a look, things are a little bit different. So you use external tooling in Pod. So Podman, this is not really a security related philosophy thing, but Podman's philosophy is a little bit more like a lot of other Linux tools, in that you should do just one thing, and then if you need other functionality, you should have other tools to do that. So for instance, Podman, you can't really build containers with Podman. This will maybe surprise some people who are used to doing Podman build, but actually what happens under the hood is there's another tool called Builda, which is called by Podman to build containers. So it's kind of like everything is modularized and kind of like, subbed out to different tools and stuff. So if you want to create a signature with Podman, you need another tool, in this case, Scopio. So I'm going to go ahead and use that to generate some keys. And so then, here's the keys. I can actually see the keys that I've just generated. And then you've got to set up some configuration. So you have to tell you have to set a configuration file in a directory and it doesn't have to be in Etsy. It can also be in your home directory. But in this case, it's in Etsy that I've set this up to say use SigStore attachments equals true. And so you basically have to set up your registry to say, hey, when I push stuff up here, I'm going to be signing it. And so then you just go ahead and tag it, and then you push it. And when you push it, you say, sign it, with my key, and here's the location of my key.
And so Dave, I want to make sure I understand that. So that Etsy containers, that's a configuration for the local registry that you're running. That's a server-side setting. Is that right?
Yeah. In this case, with this example, it doesn't have to be, but with this example, I wanted to show how to do this without, involving Docker Hub or some other public registry. So in this case, what I've done is I've actually just set up a private registry, which is listening on port 5000. And then I'm configuring it. Once again, this is the global configuration, but there's also an option to do just like a personal local configuration. But I'm configuring it to say, we're going to go ahead and sign that this is going to accept and store signatures. This registry is going to be expected to accept and store signatures. This is one of two different methods that you can use in Podman actually to sign and verify your containers. The other one it's kind of an older workflow, and it involves setting up your own look-aside server, which I didn't do because
it's handling the signatures, like the containers in one place. Okay.
Yeah, and so obviously I think that's a little simpler. You're going to have a registry, if you're working with OCI containers, so why not have the registry store your signatures as well? But I think it's two different two different signature formats as well. I think the legacy doesn't use the same signature format, and I don't know if there's an advantage to using the older format versus the newer one, or I didn't get quite that deep. But yeah, so this is kind of the workflow, and then of course, then when you go to get so this is a little different too. So when you go to pull the container, you have to kind of set another configuration. In this case, I'm doing a local configuration, and I'm saying that I'm telling it what type of signature I expect to be on the containers that I pull, and then I'm giving it the path to that public key material that I need in order to be able to pull the containers. And so now, that basically sets everything. Every time you pull anything, it's going to check for that signature. And so you can't really pull anything that's not signed, and doesn't correspond to that public key material. And so then this is what it actually looks like. So I'm just going to remove the container locally so that that I'm repulling it, and then I pull it, and I don't have to add anything here that says, here's the location of my public key material, because I already did that up here. And so there's no option or anything. It's just that everything that pulls now gets checked. And it's a little different too. Like when you sign and verify containers with Apptainer, you can have 10 signatures on one container. And you can do things with Apptainer to check, for instance, that any one of these 10 signatures is present, or only run this container if all 10 signatures are present. Or you can do stuff like that. There's not really as much flexibility as far as at least from what I've seen in my experiments with Podman. There might be ways to instantiate that, but
I can imagine maybe you could do that kind of thing with the other path, with the look-aside server, if these signatures are something that's discrete and you could just check those things independently.
Yeah, maybe.
That's just me surmising. I have a couple of questions outside of the signature context, if that's all right, Dave. Or did you have more to share there with those?
I'm going real deep into just one particular aspect of all this.
So like when I think of user namespaces, I'm still kind of new to it. I've used it, but I know that one of the things you need are these Etsy sub-UID and sub-GID files. And my understanding there is that it's an authorization of allowing a given user to use some typically high-numbered part of the UID and GID kind of number space within their containers. Can you talk at all? Like, are there any differences between how Podman and Apptainer handle that and handle management of those files or use of those files?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, you're totally right. So the way in which the user namespace is ideally supposed to work is that when you create a new user, you get a new entry in the configuration file etc sub UID and etc sub GID. And those entries, like if you use on a Linux system just like the add user utility, those entries will be added for you automatically. But it's kind of a pain because a lot of times in HPC we don't use like the add user utility to create a new user, right? We don't even give them an entry and etc password a lot of times. We're like, they're just managed completely through LDAP or AD or whatever. We've got an external authentication that we're using to create new users. As far as I understand it, so the way that Podman works, it really requires that. So what that entry is doing, just like you said, it's giving you a range of UIDs or GIDs that your user is now allowed to use and allowed to use as an intermediate mapping from like, basically it needs a placeholder UID or GID on the host system outside of the user namespace to map you to, or to map, different users within your container to, or whatever. It might use a lot of different UIDs and GIDs inside your container. So, as far as I understand, Podman requires those to be useful to leverage the user namespace and to run in rootless mode. Apptainer, once again, Apptainer has been around for a little bit longer and has kind of Apptainer has been designed to run in a lot of different environments with varying levels of support for user namespaces, all the way down to no support, right? And so it could be in your HPC environment that you don't have these mappings, and you're not going to have these mappings. And so if that's the case, there's a whole kind of like cascade of ways in which Apptainer will try to leverage the user namespace with less and less functionality, basically. And so so if you tried to use like fake root inside of a container in order to try to make yourself the root user of UID 0, but you are running, on a system that had the user namespace enabled, but in which you didn't have etc sub UID or sub GID configured, it would try to work around that. And it would try to work around that by doing things like potentially by mounting in the fake root utility into your container. And that's one of the different things it'll try. If you look at the Apptainer documentation about fake root, you can see there's a section in which it'll go through, like, here's the first thing it'll try. If that fails, here's the second thing it'll try, and so on and so forth. And the upshot of that is that in a lot of environments, not all of them, but in a lot of environments where everything's just not configured exactly the way the user namespace wants it, a lot of the user namespace functionality will still work, and users can still get done what they need to get done.
That's cool. I'm also looking now because I realized that ultimately the issue, and we're talking about users not being on the system, and so you're not using add user to create them, that they're coming out of LDAP, right, or some other external source. It looks like upstream, and I'm letting myself get distracted here while we're trying to have a conversation, but there's a conversation upstream about supporting sub UID and sub GID in NS switch to allow pulling those entries in from LDAP as well. So that's kind of cool. My other question was, I know that along the way you ran into some issues or confusion around SE Linux, and I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what you experienced there and how Apptainer and Podman handle SE Linux differently.
Sure. Let's see. Yeah. So, and that's actually, I would say that this is probably, once again, we're not being adversarial, but if we were keeping score, I would say this is one place in which Podman probably comes out on top, right? So the problem that I ran into is just by default, when I mounted new volumes into a Podman container and then tried to write to them, I was getting, SE Linux issues.
Yeah. I've also experienced this and been confused.
Yeah, and at first I was like, what do you do? So I'm in the VM, and I'm like, this doesn't work. Turn off SE Linux. Works. Okay, now I'm happy. But I decided, no, I can't do that, man. I'm trying to get a little bit deeper and actually understand this stuff. And so I started talking to probably our most senior developer, one of our most senior developers, certainly Cedric. And I asked him about it, and he was like, well, maybe there's just maybe Podman by default sets up an SE Linux context for you when you enter the container. And I was like, oh, that's something to look. And so I started Googling around and looking through the documentation. And yeah, that's exactly right. So there's an SE Linux context that it enters by default, which prevents you from making any changes to volumes which come in from the host system, which is kind of nice, right? Especially if you're running a container for the first time and you don't know what it's
some untrusted container that you don't know what it has. Although you did tell it to bind in your home directory, so maybe you expected to do that, but maybe not writing it.
Well, that's what I was about to say too. I mean, your home directory gets bind mounted in by default, right? With Apptainer.
Right, so, but not with Podman.
Yeah. So that's actually a nice feature to have, because with Apptainer, if you download some rando container from Docker Hub and you don't know what it does, and you run it, and in the entry point of the CMD, it's got a remove, tilde /dot or something in it, then you just blew away everything in your home directory, right? And you didn't like that. That's if you ran it without any options or without anything. It just did that. With Podman, even if you bind mounted your home directory in, unless you gave it the correct option to tell it not to enter that SE Linux context, which I guess a lot of people probably just do by default. But unless you did that, it would not just delete everything in your home directory. With Apptainer, it would. So I figured out based on the documentation what SE Linux context was being entered by Podman. And then I figured out, so you can do the same thing with Apptainer, but I've never seen anybody do it before. And it's kind of it's a pretty, messy option argument pair to do it. But there is that functionality there. It's just, once again, a case of just being different.
That functionality looks like when you say Apptainer run, you can specify an SE Linux context to join. Is that what you're saying?
Okay. Yeah. I could actually show it to you. I've saved it in the blog post here. So let me just cue it up here again. Cool. So whenever Alex is ready, here we go. Thank you, sir. So it's just right here. So there's a security option within Apptainer, which allows you to basically pass strings, and you can do kind of a lot of different things. But you can you can set the SE Linux context with this string here, where you're basically saying, this is the context I want, and this happens to be, this happens to be the exact same context based on the documentation that Podman enters just by default. And it's preventing you from altering files on the host system. So if you did this now, you can't change files on the host system that have been bind mounted in, just by virtue of the fact that they're bind mounted in. So once again, it's we talk a lot about this. I mean, it's the same feature set in this particular case. I mean, that's not true across the board. We kind of touched on some things that are fundamentally different between Apptainer and Podman, but in this case we have the same feature set, we just have different defaults, and the default in this case in Podman is more secure.
Can you specify that security option, like in the Apptainer config file? Could you set the Podman default as an Apptainer default as a site local config?
That's a good question. I don't know if you could or not.
Even if it's not there, that seems like a reasonable thing it would be pretty straightforward to add if someone
You
wanted to
can
do
almost
that.
certainly do it through environment variables.
Okay.
So, yeah. So you could make that. You could force that config somehow.
Yeah.
So I know that you're in the Apptainer Slack community as well. So that's where if you guys are out there and curious and you want to get involved with the community, one of the things that I like to remind people too is like, yeah, the community is there to help you, but you are also part of the community. So jump in as well, and and be a part of it. They definitely want you there. So that's easy again to find on our website. Just go to the open source communities and go to Apptainer and jump on that Slack. We'd love to have you. But so Dave, I know that you are active in there as well as at CIQ, really working on some things that are specific to certain customers if they want something customized or a training or something to work out special with Apptainer. So what are like some of the like best use cases that you have seen for Apptainer, where it just is like, this is definitely made for you and it just works exactly as it's supposed to?
Oh yeah. So like, yeah, I mean, well, yeah, I'll let everybody kind of talk about this. But I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer to me, but I mean, Apptainer is really built for HPC. I mean, really HPC use cases are where it shines. And that's a good for this discussion as well, because it's got intelligent defaults and an architecture which lends it to using HPC quite easily, right? Podman comes from kind of a different culture, right? Kind of a different world. So Podman is a container platform which has sensible defaults and features and architecture for the cloud native space, and works really, really well there. And I would argue that, Apptainer is probably not a very good fit for a lot of the kinds of things that people do in the cloud native space. We've, through development, we've gone through and we've kind of made, we kind of went through a phase where we were making Apptainer more attractive to that space. And we got like, the community was kind of like not super crazy about it. They like to use Apptainer for HPC. That's where the community's at. So we're going to continue to kind of develop Apptainer for, what people want to use it for. And then the flip is probably true as well. I mean, I am not, if you read this blog post, you'll probably figure out pretty quick that I'm not like a power user of Podman. I can get done what I need to get done, but not like Apptainer. I mean, I don't use it on a daily basis. And I would say that, like, it's just, if you're used to using containers in HPC, it's just kind of clunky, there's this whole different kind of feel with any OCI container platform, I think, where it's like you're more hands off with your containers. And a lot of people kind of, talk about that and that being a benefit. That's what you want. You want your containers to just be like, cattle that just run off and do stuff, and you just roll them around. But I mean, me, like, I want to see my container when I pull it. I want to have it, where I can change its name and move it from one place to another. I want to enter the container with shell and not have to remember, what the particular options and arguments and all that stuff is, that I, get a shell inside the container. And, I just want that convenience to be able to just like be hands-on and do stuff with the container and not like have this layer of indirection in between me and the container that I have to like tell, something else to go do something with the container and have it done. But that's just, that's what I'm used to. And that's what I like coming from HPC. And that's what works for me.
Cool.
Yeah, I would broaden that just a little bit, because, Apptainer comes up from HPC, but it's not the high performance part. There are performance benefits to Apptainer for sure that make it a good fit for HPC, but it's not the high performance part that limits Apptainer's applicability. It's the kind of Unix family of philosophies where you have tools that you execute at a command line that participate in a pipeline and kind of have access to a shared file system. Apptainer integrates really well into that ecosystem of tools, because that's what the HPC ecosystem is. You're a person sitting at a Unix command line or a Linux command line, and you run tools in a script that interact with each other through the file system. Podman, being part of the kind of cloud native philosophy and community, their practice is services rather than a shared file system. So they want to run a process and then have different processes interact with each other over sockets in the network. And so if you're running a service or an appliance or some kind of application that's kind of isolated, and you prefer that isolation over an integration of tools that work together, then that's where Podman really shines. And its integrations with systemd even make that more obvious in kind of a modern Rocky Linux context. But you can use Apptainer for that as well, especially if what you're running are services that are meant to integrate with that local shared file system. So there's overlap for sure, but it to me, it really comes down to whether you're writing network services that talk over the network almost exclusively, or you're operating at a command line, and that command line is your ecosystem.
Yeah, that was a nice comparison. Thank you, Jonathan. Brian?
I think the use case that appeals to me the most about Apptainer is the ability to have your container encrypted on disk. And this is really important in the HPC context, especially if you're running, export control types of code where it needs to be super secure, needs to be encrypted at rest, and Apptainer gives you a way of actually doing that. This is important in areas like CFD if you're running, supersonic simulations, stuff like that. Yeah.
Awesome.
I'd like to tack on to something Jonathan said too. So you were talking about the difference between Apptainer and Podman as far as and that's a key difference. I'm really glad you brought that up as far as Podman coming from a world in which containers are expected to interact with one another through the network. And then you said you could kind of do that with Apptainer as well. But I also want to highlight there's some fundamental differences in what an unprivileged user can do with networking with Podman versus Apptainer. So that's another thing. So because of that different emphasis, the network namespace and network interfaces within the network namespace and all that kind of stuff are not really very well supported, honestly, with Apptainer. So you've got to be a privileged user to do pretty much anything useful with Apptainer. On the other hand, Podman uses something called Slurp for NetFS, and it allows you to use an unprivileged protocol to kind of spoof a lot of privileged operations within the container, essentially. You can't do everything, and the performance evidently is degraded by doing this, so it's not as performant. But you can do a lot of unprivileged networking with Podman that you just don't have access to and just can't do at all with Apptainer. Once again, not an issue for most HPC users who don't care about that stuff, but that would be a tremendous probably issue, especially if you were trying to do unprivileged stuff within a cloud native environment. That would be a problem.
Right. Well, guys, I think that we could probably go on forever and ever, but we have come to the end of our webinar. So thank you so much, all of you, for being here and for sharing with us. Thank you for everybody at home and everyone who's listening and watching. We'll be back here, same time, same place. But always, we want to talk to you guys, right? So here is our SA team, plus a couple of others, our little dream team here, that is more than happy to dive into, what exactly your environment needs, right? And what's best for it and how we can help support you. And so just, you can reach out on our website, ciq.com, and we'd be so happy. And also, of course, I'm sure that Alex, you put the little link in there for everyone to join the Apptainer Slack community if you want to be part of that community. So thank you guys. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Rose. Thanks, Alex.
Bye.